Okay, so the date is Thursday, the 23rd of September. I'm ED's content editor, Matt Mace, and I'll be chairing this hour-long discussion on tackling your Scope 3 emissions on the road to net zero. Apologies. The majority of most organisations' emissions and cost reduction opportunities sitting outside of their own operations. Scope 3 emissions represent a significant opportunity to identify hotspots, improve efficiencies, and positively engage with employers and suppliers that ignites a wider change than the business would otherwise be able to recognise by just focusing on its operations. But measuring, reporting, and ultimately reducing these emissions can be tough. It requires a clear strategy, detailed data analysis, and a wide-ranging engagement plan across the supply chain and teams. That is hopefully what this Scope 3 Emissions Masterclass will do. It is brought to you as part of ED's Scope 3 Emissions Master Series with Common Intelligence, and is a masterclass-style webinar that will equip you with information, inspiration, and innovations you need to improve Scope 3 data analysis and hopefully reductions further down the line. So this masterclass is going to be split into two parts. The first part will see two industry experts deliver presentations on how to manage and reduce Scope 3 emissions, and the second part will be an open Q&A, allowing audience members to have their questions answered. As such, we are inviting questions from you, the audience. You'll see the Q&A function at the bottom of this window. Please use that to submit your questions rather than the chat. In fact, I'm hoping that the chat should be disabled for anyone other than the panelists. So please keep questions in there. However, myself and the panelists may use a chat function to share a few relevant links with you. We do have a lot of people in this virtual audience today. So I can't promise that we'll be able to get through all your questions, but I'll be keeping a note of the most relevant talking points and questions and try and get through as many as possible. This masterclass series is being recorded, which means you'll be able to access the slides and presentations via a recording, and that will be sent to you around 24 hours or so after this session has finished. I do think that that is it for housekeeping rules, though, which means we can delve quite nicely into these presentations. So first up, we're going to be hearing from Annabelle James, who is Associate Director at Carbon Intelligence. Annabelle joined Carbon Intelligence in 2018 to help drive the transition towards net zero by working with a range of businesses to embed sustainability in not just their operations, but their value chains. Annabelle leads the reporting services and is a technical expert in greenhouse gas emissions reporting, Scope 3, life cycle analysis, external ESG frameworks, and is also experienced in supporting global businesses to set ambitious net zero strategies. As mentioned, Annabelle and Carbon Intelligence have been helping us with our master's content around this topic, so who better to kick this conversation off? So Annabelle, if you join me up on this virtual stage, so to speak, I'll be putting my mic on mute and turning my camera off temporarily. Great, I can see you. Can I hear you?
Yes, I think so.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay, I'll put myself on mute and allow you to get on with your presentation. So thanks, Annabelle.
Great, thanks, Matt, and thanks for having us on today to discuss how to tackle Scope 3 emissions on the road to net zero. Yeah, we're really pleased to be here. Looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A panel later. So firstly, I just wanted to do a bit of a quick introduction to Carbon Intelligence for those of you who haven't met us before. So we are a world-class team of strategists, data technologists, scientists and engineers based in London. There's about 130 of us, and we work across 60 countries globally. And the whole team is really driven by a mission and a purpose that we see business as the solutions to achieving net zero globally. And we deliver on this mission by working with our clients to support their net zero ambitions through the lens of our 6 dimensions framework, which you can see on the screen. So this framework was developed in collaboration with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and we use it to develop long-term holistic sustainability programs for our clients that drive real impact and change, the change that's required kind of on this journey towards achieving net zero. So firstly, I just wanted to provide a little bit of a recap on Scope 3, just so we're all on the same page. So when we're talking about Scope 3 emissions, we're referring to all of the indirect emissions that occur in the value chain of your business. So this could be anything from the upstream embodied emissions impact of the purchased goods and services that you buy, to the downstream impact of your products that you sell to your customers. Scope 3, as Matt mentioned, typically accounts for about 90% of a business's overall emissions impact. And this really means that it's a key area of climate-related risk, both now and in the future. And as such, it's become kind of a hot topic with investors, regulators, and other stakeholders, and something that businesses really need to become more aware of. We're seeing Scope 3 increasingly being included in upcoming regulation such as TCFD, and it's also a key requirement for any business wishing to set a credible science-based target and net zero strategy as well. So the main message I guess I wanted to get across here is that that we can no longer afford to kind of ignore our Scope 3 emissions, and really, if we want to be seen by our stakeholders as having a kind of credible, robust approach to sustainability and tackling climate change, then we need to be addressing Scope 3 today. And so on this slide, I wanted to share with you what a typical Scope 3 profile might look like for a business. So Scope 3 emissions are broken down by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol into 15 different categories of emissions. And not every single category will be relevant to your organization. So this will really be dependent on your individual business model and the sector that you operate in. So, for example, if you're a professional services firm, you may have a significant emissions impact related to business travel, whereas if you are working in kind of retail and manufacturing space, it's likely that you'll see a greater emissions impact upstream in your supply chain. One thing that we can say from our experience in working with businesses on Scope 3 is that a key category that always crops up as an emissions hotspot within the value chain is the emissions associated with your purchased goods and services. So this is the emissions impact of your supply chain. And so today we're really going to focus our kind of insights and advice on that section of Scope 3. Obviously, there's plenty more that we could cover on the other categories, but I think that would probably be another webinar in itself. So addressing Scope 3 is often really challenging for businesses, and the World Economic Forum actually did some research on this recently, and we just presented here some of the key findings and what those barriers are for businesses to address Scope 3. So they're typically around kind of having a lack of high quality data from your supply chain, having to rely on a lot of estimations within your Scope 3 calculations, a knowledge gap between kind of your sustainability team and your supply chain, and also other internal teams within your business. So the way that we kind of support our clients to address some of these challenges is kind of twofold. So firstly, building a data program to really improve the quality and the accuracy of your Scope 3 emissions. And then secondly, developing an engagement program to work with your supply chain to upskill them in understanding emissions footprinting, and also to engage your internal teams as well and to close that knowledge gap there. So I now wanted to just go into those two areas in a little bit more detail. So this diagram here shows the typical journey we would support a business on in improving data quality across their supply chain. So quite often the starting point is at the bottom of this data hierarchy. So using spend-based emission factors to hotspot your supplier base from an emissions perspective and identify those key suppliers and key emission hotspots. This initial step is the foundation on which you can then overlay greater granularity and engagement kind of as you move along the journey of data improvement. So typically what we see is businesses then engaging with their suppliers and using a supplier-based method to calculate key categories or industry LCA, so life cycle assessment emission factors on top of that. And really the ultimate aim here for those key emission sources, those key suppliers, is to get to a point where they are actually providing you with life cycle assessment emissions data on the products and services that they're providing to you. It's probably worth mentioning that greenhouse gas accounting in itself is developing all the time. It's not as mature as other forms of accounting, such as financial accounting. So methodologies, approaches, data sources do vary between companies. And I think the important message here is to start with that spend-based screening to be able to build a kind of strategic plan on how to approach this. And the key benefits really of moving along this data hierarchy are, having increased data accuracy and engagement with suppliers is a way to better control those supply chain carbon-related risks and actually reduce data uncertainties and costs in the future relating to kind of achieving net zero and purchasing carbon removals, for example. And the second key area that we wanted to just touch on was engaging with the suppliers, your supply chain, to kind of cascade climate action through your supplier base. So typically here we would work with a business to segment their suppliers into different categories. So whether that's those that where you're spending the most, those with the highest emissions impact, potentially looking at the maturity of their approach to sustainability, whether they are in a procurement category that could be seen to have a high level of ESG risk. And then in kind of overlaying these factors on your supply chain, you can really start to build tailored engagement approaches on how to encourage them to start providing you with more accurate data and actually to set their own emission reduction strategies. So, for example, here for the suppliers that you might see as having, a high emissions impact, but perhaps having a low sustainability maturity, they would be the ones that you could follow up with a kind of more in-depth engagement, providing tools and resources to upskill them on how to tackle their own emissions footprint. Obviously, this in turn will then reduce your business's Scope 3 emissions as well. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on the importance of having a really good technical solution to manage the data and engagement that you'll need to do as a business as you track your progress towards net zero. So what we're seeing is that over the next decade, the volume of data engagements that is required just can't sit in spreadsheets forever. And businesses are really going to need to be able to, track their data on a regular basis accurately, monitor how they're engaging with suppliers and the impact of that engagement. Use the data to identify insights and decarbonisation opportunities, and have a way of accurately reporting to key stakeholders such as investors with confidence, particularly on Scope 3. So actually at the moment, Carbon Intelligence is working to build a next generation kind of platform solution to tackle some of these challenges using our experience of over the last 10 years, having worked with a number of companies on Scope 3 and decarbonisation strategies. We're actually running an early adopter kind of program. So if this is something that could be of interest, then please do get in touch with us. Great. So that was everything that I wanted to cover. And as I said, happy to answer any questions in the Q&A session later. If there is anything that I've mentioned that you would like to find out a bit more about, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with the Carbon Intelligence team. And I'll hand back over to you, Matt.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Annabelle. We've already had a few questions come in, some that I feel maybe would be more relevant for a discussion with your team rather than a Q&A panel-led type high-level discussion. So maybe for some of the questions that we've already had in, if the audience is fine, we would pass those on to Annabelle and her team, and they'd be able to respond back that way if we don't get time at the end of this webinar, if that's fine. But for now, I'm going to move on to our next speaker. So, Annabelle, if I can ask you, I think the camera is off. I think mine has just frozen. So, yeah, we're going to hand over to the next speaker now. Before we go into the Q&A, I'm worried that we're getting a lot of questions and that it's probably best that we spend as much time as possible going through them. So we're going to be hearing from one of the end user businesses that Carbon Intelligence has been working with in this area. So Sophie Oldfield is the sustainability manager at Avara. The food giant states in its most recent responsible business report that it's establishing clear roadmaps for the years ahead that will help set science-based targets and deliver commitments for a net zero world. And I know Scope 3 is a real big area for you and your team. Sophie, I can see you up on the screen now. So again, a reminder to the audience to keep questions coming in. For those that have asked, the slides will be made available in the sense that you'll be able to watch this back at your leisure. But Sophie, I'm going to put myself on mute and hand over to you now.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks everyone for having me today. Awesome. So yeah, thanks everyone for having me today. Today I'm just going to be talking about our carbon journey, specifically focusing in on Scope 3 reporting and carbon accounting. So for those of you who don't know who Avara Foods are one of the largest food production companies in the UK. We produce British poultry and supply around 4.5 million chickens and turkeys a week to the nation's most popular supermarkets and restaurants. Our products range from whole chickens to portions from breasts to thighs to livers, all the way through to added value. So your chicken sausages, chicken mince, and your flavoured chicken. So for example, chicken tikka. We're quite a modern business. We were formed in 2018 following a joint venture, but we have a really strong heritage that backdates all the way to the 1960s. I think the thing that sort of stands sort of Avara in good stead is our really vertically integrated supply chain. We manage our supply chain all the way from farm, all the way through to our customers. We have over 300 farms within our agricultural base, and those farms are made up of both contract and company-owned farms, which are all managed by the agricultural team in order for the birds to get as best possible start as possible. All of our farms are grown to really strict standards, and most of our birds are reared within well-ventilated, well-lit, and very regularly audited barns. This audit program is really important to us, and this is to enable us to really keep a strong hold on biosecurity and bird welfare, which is critical and at the heart of everything that we do. Alongside our farms, we have 7 hatcheries, 3 feed mills, and 8 production sites. These production sites include primary processing, further processing, and added value. We really pride ourselves on producing really great tasting, high quality and safe food for everybody. We have incredibly high standards and grow everything to red tractor standard as a minimum. However, we don't really think it's what we do that makes a difference, but it's really how we do it, and people are very much at the heart of all of that. We're a company that love to live and work right by our values. And for us, our values are inclusivity, integrity, excelling, and ambitious. We really want to be a company that you want to work with and for. So when that comes to sustainability, we really felt that sustainability was at the heart of this and at the heart of our values, with people being very much at the centre of all of that. When we came to start looking at environmental sustainability and what that meant for Avara, I think it became very clear to us from the beginning that we could never ever look at sustainability and environmental sustainability rather in its own separate silo, because whatever we do and whatever decisions we make around environmental decisions tend to have a repercussive effect on the rest of our business. Therefore, whenever we talk about sustainability, we always think and talk about these 3 circles, because really we want to be able to produce affordable, accessible food that's available to all sectors of society. We want to be able to do this safely. We also want to be able to do this while reducing our environmental footprint and aiming for that net zero goal for environmental footprint. We also have to do this while maintaining and improving our responsible farming and ethical practices. As I said, bird welfare is very much at the heart and the centre of everything that we do, and we have to make sure that whatever decisions we make will never ever compromise this. Finding a balance between all 3 of these circles is a real challenge, because quite often when you're trying to focus on one area very much individually, it starts to pull away from the other 2. Therefore, our approach and our aim is to be able to get data and the facts and the figures behind all 3 of these circles, so that we can actually really start to weigh things up against each other and actually make really informed decisions, and putting that in front of our customers and consumers, so that actually we can really start forging that best way forward. So deep diving into carbon emissions and emissions reporting, our emissions and carbon journey started back in January 2020, really, which is when I was pulled into the team. I think the thing that spearheaded us on this journey was, especially in the meat industry, seeing a lot of talk about what the emissions footprint of poultry was. I think somebody mentioned to me, how do they know what the emissions footprint of chicken is, when we don't even know what it is, and we're the ones that actually have the data and have the resources to actually be able to figure out what that footprint is. So we very much started out this journey and created a 3-phase plan on how we were going to, number 1, determine what our baseline is, and put in process the steps needed in order for us to start working towards the UK's net zero commitment. So phase 1 was all around determining our baselines. This included our scope 1 and 2 emissions baseline, which we now get verified annually to ISO 14064 standard. We also started off on the scope 3 journey, and we did this in partnership with Carbon Intelligence. We wanted to understand what our scope 3 footprint was and what this impact was, and where our hotspots lay within that scope 3. Obviously, once you then know your baseline, the next logical thing to do is to set a target, and actually then really start to drive that progress down towards zero. And actually, we're right in the middle of phase 2 right now, and we've got our science-based targets out for submission, so fingers crossed, touch wood, they'll be approved really soon. Alongside this, and setting our science-based targets required quite a deep dive into our scope 3 hotspots and starting that key engagement with our suppliers. Alongside this, and sort of in line with this, we've also been developing our strategy. We've been setting the agenda, nailing the data, integrating all of this into our business plan, and that key part of connecting with all the key stakeholders, whether that's internal employees, customer, consumers, and suppliers. Phase 3 of our plan is all around putting in place the practices and getting out those action plans, and actually hitting those action plans and seeing results. And we're going to be doing this by reducing our footprint, first and foremost. We want to produce more with less. Efficiency is something very much at the heart of Avara and very much part of our whole business journey so far. And it's something that I think we already do really well, and something that I think will be really easy for us to sort of take under our wing and keep striving forwards with. Our second stage is to replace, basically replacing non-sustainable resources with lower greenhouse gas emissions goods and services. And our third point of call is recycling, encouraging those circular economies, becoming more self-sufficient, and actually taking value from our waste and turning that into resource that we can use to power our factories, or use within our products, or within our factories. So we've been on quite a journey so far, and I say we're very much in the heart of stage 2 and phase 2 at the moment. And we've made some really good achievements to date, but we still very much view that we are very much at the tip of the iceberg of our journey, and we view science-based targets and that sort of action plan very much as the catalyst for change within our business. I think a good example of something that we've already done, and I think we'll come to reiterate as I continue this presentation, is that we've already actually made really great strides, particularly within our scope 1 and 2 emissions. And this is just something that we've done naturally within Avara. Since 2015, we've reduced our Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 56%. And this is done predominantly through the implementation of our ISO 50001 energy management scheme, which we've had in place in some of our sites since 2015, but collectively had more and more sites inputted and involved in that. And also through our purchase of renewable and nuclear energy. And these were things that we actually had started to look at and introduce before we even started looking at greenhouse gas accounting. And therefore it really sort of highlighted to me that we're probably doing a lot as a business that we just don't have the data to report on and highlight those good work that people are doing. And I think that's also very clear within our Scope 3 accounting. So getting on to the big one. So this is the output of that initial Scope 3 exercise that we did with Carbon Intelligence. And it's essentially a hotspot analysis of our total Scope 3 carbon footprint. So including all 15 categories within the greenhouse gas protocol. As you can see from this pinwheel, Scope 1 and 2 is only 5% of our total farm to fork emissions, with feed and grain and agriculture making up the large proportion of our farm to fork emissions, which wasn't necessarily surprising. This was an invaluable exercise to us. I mean, I think we all have a bit of an idea of where the true heavy emitters are within our supply chain. However, once you've got the figures and you've got that evidence to back up the evidence, it really gives you a really clear idea of the areas that you need to deep dive into, the suppliers that you have to engage with, and the areas that actually are going to be relevant to actually focus on in that little bit more detail. I think it's easy to say that Scope 3 can seem quite overwhelming when you look at it and you see the amount of numbers and the amount of work that goes into calculating something like this. But once you actually get it in this sort of format, it makes it much easier to sort of get your head around, strategize and make a plan on how to action it, which is exactly what we've done. So as Annabelle mentioned, when you talk about Scope 3, well, for us, it's quite easy to segregate it into a data roadmap and a reduction roadmap. They go very much hand in hand, and without good data, you'll never actually be able to report on the good work that you have done in improving your emissions. As Annabelle touched on, there's different methods that can be used to calculate emissions from Scope 3, and all of these different methodologies have different varying accuracy outputs of emissions. Our initial screening exercise was predominantly using spend-based methodology, which is essentially applying conversion factors to the amount of money you've spent on particular goods, services, and capex goods, for example. The best way of calculating emissions is through life cycle analysis. And really, once we got that sort of pinwheel back, when we saw the data, the streams that we came out of it, it became very clear that actually, in order for us to progress within our Scope 3 accounting and therefore hit our targets and hit net zero, we really needed to try and move away from spend-based methodology as quickly as possible into more activity-based data calculation methods. Another quite key thing for us when we sort of got that pinwheel and started sharing that with, especially internally with some of our key managers, it really hit us that actually, while having that pinwheel was a really great way of seeing that overall footprint from a more practical, functional point of view, having that in more granular detail, so that actually we can start seeing the supply chain visibility of our products from farm to fork would be a much easier way of doing it. So, for example, a hatchery manager can sit there and actually go, okay, this is my Scope 1 and 2 footprint, and this is my Scope 3 footprint for my hatcheries, and similarly for farms. And seeing it that way and actually giving the people who have operational control over those facilities or that proportion of that footprint gives them visibility and then the functions to be able to then put in place practices that can actually improve that. And I think that's sort of the whole part about data and getting that better data granularity. It's all good having it in a very top level point of view. However, you have to then also be able to share it down across your employees, across your supply chain, so that they can actually see their impact as well and start seeing where those hotspots are within their sort of proportion of that footprint. So we're improving our data by bettering the granularity of our spend and capex reports. This is a relatively easy thing to do, and it's something that I say we've already done for the most part. We're also obtaining much better and fuller quantitative data for our purchased goods and services. So, for example, the total tons of plastics purchased, ingredients that goes into our products. We've also started and have actually completed a number of life cycle assessments on the sort of key hotspots within our supply chain. This is particularly relevant for feed and farming, and we have actually done a full LCA assessment on our feed footprint, which is it's really exciting, gives us much better detail and granularity of our hotspots within that specific feed bit of pie diagram. We're also exploring and working with Scope 3 accounting databases and tools, such as working with a farm footprinting tool. For us, we're working with AgriCalc so that we can actually do on-farm LCA assessments for each individual farm, which gives feedback back to the farmers, a benchmarking exercise, but then also gives us the output that we can then integrate into our overall Scope 3 proportion. So we're really new into this area, and we're really new into this journey. Our first baseline was for 2019, and that's what our baseline is for our science-based targets. But even since then, since focusing on this and having that breakdown, we've actually managed to move our footprint away from spend-based methodology, so that nearly half our footprint, or over half our footprint, is now calculated not using spend-based methodology. And it's something that actually, I think, I was surprised that we've managed to do that quite so quickly. I think once you put your mind to it and actually start talking to people and talking to suppliers, you'll realise that people actually have a lot more data than you might originally think is out there. So then getting on to that reductions roadmap, and again touching on quite a lot on what Annabelle says, all of our reduction initiatives are very much dependent on collaboration efforts. Like I say, we're subcategorizing our spend. This is something we can do internally, and it's something that is going to be really, really useful to get better granularity and to better understand those opportunity hotspots. We've done a feed life cycle analysis in connection with some of our suppliers to get a better picture of emissions and the land use change impacts of our feed. We've already started engaging and communicating a lot more with our customers on greenhouse gas emissions and sustainability. That way we can work with them to help design lower impact products. For example, we've recently designed a new pouch packaging solution which reduces our plastic footprint by about 50% compared to conventional packaging, and therefore that lower amount of plastic usage has a positive impact on our carbon footprint, and therefore having the data to be able to highlight and capture that is really, really important to us and really exciting. We've also started engaging and talking to our contract grower base. Like I say, we've got over 300 growers. It's a big task to get all of them engaged, all of them involved in collecting and reporting data. Therefore, it's much more of a sort of collaboration effort. We give and we take in both sort of senses with them. Like, we very much view that as a partnership. We work together rather than as a sort of typical supplier relationship. And we're working with them alongside this ag footprinting tool in order to gain better data to help give the farmers data that they need to understand, what even is a good farm, what makes a good poultry farm when it comes to carbon footprinting, and what makes a bad farm, and what can we do to sort of level everyone up to be match that good farm. And that's where their benchmarking is really, really important. And then from that, we're going to collectively work together to help reduce emissions. We've already started discussing and sort of got the framework of a plan about our supplier engagement program. I think for us as the sort of medium sort of size or large size business, but we have a lot of very small scale suppliers who don't have the resource and the knowledge to really put into greenhouse gas accounting. And for us, we saw this as an immediate sort of problem, I'd say. Bigger suppliers and bigger companies, we've realised through experience so far, have a lot of data, and they've even done quite a lot of LCA work, so they can actually provide us with really accurate emissions that we can then feed into our Scope 3. However, these smaller suppliers, that relationship is going to be so much more important, and it's much more about working together to help them and upskill them to be able to then provide the data and work with us to get to where we want to be. And therefore, when we're sort of just talking about our supply engagement program, I think it became very clear there's not sort of one size all fit all solution to this. And actually, we're going to have to be a bit flexible and adaptable to how we actually start engaging with our total supplier base. Alongside this, and once we've got that better data, we can start, and we have started already, doing scenario analysis and trial work. This is just clearly to understand the potentials to reduce emissions further. So, for example, with our feed, looking at new and novel ingredients, but then also looking at the small incremental changes that we could potentially make, and then actually seeing the impacts of those through life cycle assessment, so that actually we can start making and seeing the true impacts of some of the decisions that we're making, and what decisions we could make in order to start chipping away towards net zero. Another thing that we're doing is very much looking at our waste and water, which are also another two key pillars within our sustainability strategy. And we're working very closely with colleagues and supply partners to better understand the opportunities to reduce the volumes of both of these that we use, but also, as I say, introduce more circular economy solutions into our business. So similarly, as I said before, there's a lot of feedback between good data and then the reduction opportunities. Without good data, you'll never be able to highlight the good work that you've done. So just to sort of finish off with all of this, I really had sort of three key takeaway messages that I thought would be quite good to share. I'd say it is quite daunting looking from the outside at Scope 3, because it does seem like this sort of big, ever-growing area, and it seems like quite a difficult thing to actually put in place those sort of fixed plans with. And while I say we have made significant progress, and we have had big achievements to date, we do really view this as very much being the start of our journey, and I'm sure we'll learn a whole lot more in the next year to come. And I think that's part of what I want to say, is that you have to start somewhere. We started the blank piece of paper with this sort of rough ambition of understanding what our poultry's carbon footprint was. And only through starting this journey did we realise how complex it was to get to that point. And actually, I want to sort of say, don't be afraid that all the answers and principles aren't there, because we're all going through this journey together. And I've definitely come across blockers and struggles where I've been like, there isn't a solution yet. And there isn't a solution to all the things that you will probably want to achieve, but we're all going down that road together, and trust your gut and be logical. Another piece of advice along that line is keeping a really, really good set of evidence, like a really good evidence portfolio, detailing exactly where and when you use different methodologies, your data sources, exactly where you've got it from, your conversion factors, and how and where you've got them from, I think is going to be so imperative along this journey. And I think that will also really help with my next point, which is really to try and maintain really clear and straightforward communication about Scope 3 reporting. Keeping that evidence pack will be really imperative when you actually start to verify it and record and externally share the details of Scope 3. And I have to admit, we're incredibly transparent about our Scope 3 journey with our customers and with our consumers, because we want it to be as simple and as understandable to them as well as it is to us. And I think this will all help in terms of avoiding greenwashing. I think that's a big worry, I think, for a lot of businesses, especially for a business like us. We want to do the right thing, and we really are trying to do the right thing. And I think for us, part of that is just being really honest and transparent about, what is a data improvement because we've changed our conversion factor or changed our accounting methodology, and what's an actual greenhouse gas reduction based on a project that we've done, and actually making that distinction really clear, because that top number, that baseline, will change as and when you change data sources. And also my final point, which is I think something I've reiterated a lot through this presentation, is engagement and collaboration is crucial. And I think this is from day one. It's internally the different teams that you have to engage in, which is pretty much every team. For us, and our ambition in our team is actually to integrate sustainability and environmental sustainability into our culture. And to do that, you have to be talking about it. You have to have data visibility. And you also have to be talking about this openly and regularly to customers and suppliers, because we really do feel that progress is not made by the company, but it's actually made by the people who make it what it is. And us as sustainability professionals just have to provide people with the tools and resources to actually go ahead and make and target those reductions, because I wouldn't underestimate the appetite for your colleagues and staff for sustainability within your business. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Sophie. A great in-depth look at Avara's journey to date. And if I can ask you to stay on screen for the questions. And Annabelle, could you also join us with your camera back on, please? Great. We've had a lot of questions, which isn't surprising considering the size of the audience. And as I suppose expected, it seems different areas or different members of the audience are on different parts of their journey on this. Some are starting out, some are very much where Avara are right now, some are maybe even a little bit more advanced. So the range of questions are different based on how far that person's in the journey, but I'm trying my best to kind of group them into areas so we can get through as many as possible. The first one is to do with spend-based emissions calculations. A couple of the questions are, essentially, what is this? And I suppose a follow-up to that is there a danger as you move away from spend-based to something that's a bit more granular that your reporting aspects might change? It might actually showcase a rise in emissions, which might not look good to stakeholders. So, Annabelle, maybe if we can get you on just to kind of give a brief summary of spend-based and what the benefits, but also the drawbacks are. And then, Sophie, if we come to you to get that kind of your perspective on as you moved away from that, what kind of happened?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. So when we talk about spend-based emission factors, we're talking about basically an emission factor that is associated to the amount that you've spent on a particular product or service. They're created using economic input-output models at kind of country level, and how that then equates down to different sectors and services. So it's it's a high level estimate, I would say, but it's really useful to identify those emission hotspots and the areas that you need to focus in on to get better accuracy in the future.
So would you say it's more of a kind of a first step if you're really struggling for the data? That's a good kind of baseline to set, and you can build from there.
Exactly, yeah. And there's different kind of sources available that you can use. You would have seen on the slides that I shared earlier, Qantas. So that's a tool that people can use to access these types of emission factors and apply it to their procurement spend as a starting point.
Great, thank you, Annabelle. And Sophie, some people have asked, if and as and when they kind of switch from a spend-based one and the detail does come more granular, essentially, what could happen there? Is it a time to then revisit baselines? Is it time to potentially showcase to stakeholders that your scope 3 emissions were greater than you first thought, but you're still kind of putting measures in place to reduce it? What's the best way to approach that?
I think this is where it's that really clear communication side comes of it, because baselines will change. I think that's something that we've had to accept and sort of come to terms with, and keeping that evidence pack of how and when those changes are right and what is causing those shifts in that overall scope 3 number. I think, like, similarly for us, it's not being too fixated on your total number of emissions that comes out the other side of it, because actually relatively that doesn't matter really, as long as you're reducing. That's the point of doing all of this, and that's the point of measuring and reporting on carbon emissions. It's all about that reduction journey, and fundamentally you need good data to be able to show those reductions. And any customer should be aware of this, and if they're not aware of it, it's about informing them and talking them through it, and actually being as open and transparent about it as possible. We've got nothing to hide. I'm sure our footprint will go up and it will come down depending on the different accounting methodologies and as and when they change, because they will.
Great. And another area which garnered a lot of questions was the topic of double counting. Essentially, as we're using these estimates, there's going to be some data that's not as reliable as others, and kind of concerns about double counting. So a question to both of you, maybe we'll start with Annabelle again on this, is how should a business approach double counting? Should they acknowledge that it could happen? Do they just kind of wait until the data is more granular? What kind of steps should they be taking here?
Yeah, really good question, and one that we get asked a lot. So within your your own business's scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint, the categorization that the GHG protocol has given us means that there shouldn't be any double counting, for example, between your scope 1 and your scope 3 emissions. But actually, when you look at scope 3, double counting between different entities is an inherent part of scope 3. So, your supply chain emissions are your supplier's direct emissions. And the idea behind this double counting just only within scope 3 is that actually that collaborative effort is needed to reduce scope 3 emissions. So each different entity, although they might be looking at the same source of emissions, will have a different capabilities to influence and reduce those emissions, whether that's engaging with your suppliers or the supplier kind of directly making the reductions themselves. So it's to kind of create that momentum and shared kind of effort to reduce scope 3 emissions across supply chains.
Great, and same question to Sophie, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll say it's probably something quite similar. It's like we found double counting in ours. And when you find it, you put in practice a place to stop it going forward, and actually just being really open and honest about it. It will happen. It does happen. And something that we've been quite conscious of in all of our reporting is always to take a slightly conservative approach to it all, and always do slightly worst case scenario approaches for it all. And I think that's something that for us is sort of built into our culture a little bit, because we don't like to blow our own trumpet where it's not true, if that makes sense. But like I say, it's about showcasing your reductions and those physical reductions from the projects that you've implemented, and like I say, having good data will come, and it's a journey. And I think people appreciate that.
And Sophie, you mentioned that this journey for you that you're going started out with a blank page, a blank piece of paper is I think the term you used. And I think a lot of people in the audience are probably in the same way, and they've businesses, some smaller, some the same size, some bigger than Avar in terms of scope. And certainly for the bigger companies that maybe have value chains that span multiple continents, what are the kind of the first words or the first kind of bits of data you put down on that blank page to start when your value chain is as big as it is?
I'd say learn the fundamentals first about the accounting principles. I mean, when I started this, I didn't even know what scope 3 emissions were. And now I'm on a webinar talking about them. You pick up the knowledge really, really quickly. And I think for us, working with someone like Carbon Intelligence was really, really useful. It was brilliant and helped give us that sort of initial structure and knowledge that we needed in order to calculate our scope 3 emissions. But following the greenhouse gas protocol, it's pretty clear. Those 15 categories, looking at your spend it will be the majority of your footprint. Everybody has spend related reports, and actually using that as your sort of base for your scope 3 emissions is very much where to sit. And I wouldn't say change the model. Most of our scope 3 categories are our spend categories. And that way, then you just build in the subcategorization within that and using that as the framework of how you start modeling it out. Like I say, it's like I'm quite passionate about sustainability. It is a sort of function in its own, but it should always be ingrained in your business functions, because everybody should have some form of responsibility over sustainability and visibility over it, and everyone has the power and the influence to reduce your footprint. So yeah, it's like ingraining it within the business. So don't think you need to change everything to make it start. You'll have quite a lot of the tools and data there already.
Okay, no, good to know, and I'm sure that'll reassure a few of the members of our audience. And Annabelle, I actually want to flip that question actually and look at the smaller businesses, and there's a fair few of them in the audience. SMEs, some are startups with a very kind of, I suppose, limited value chain, but they still want to kind of get to grips whether they feel there's going to be a legislative requirement or kind of a reputational benefit of doing so. For the businesses that don't necessarily have the capacity, whether that's time, personnel, or I suppose understanding of this, how can they start their journey?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So from an ambition perspective, the Science Based Target Initiative does actually have a pathway for SME companies to sign up to science-based targets and net zero. And that's really a good place to start in terms of stating your intention and your commitment as a business. And then from an actual accounting perspective, a lot of the resources that we use are freely available. For example, as Sophie mentioned, the greenhouse gas protocol, you can read that and access that and try and understand it. Obviously, it's difficult if you don't have, a sustainability team sitting behind you. But I'd also argue that SMEs have a fortunate position of being perhaps more agile than the larger companies, and they'll have the ability to kind of really take this on and embed it into their business models as they grow, which from my perspective, it seems like perhaps an easier approach than trying to change, a really large company that's perhaps got very embedded processes. I think that's a longer, perhaps more challenging thing to do. So yeah, I'd really reach out and look for those kind of SME targeted kind of information and guidance that's out there already.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Annabelle. And obviously, a lot of the questions were around engaging with the supply chain, incentivizing them, giving that capacity to understand. I know both of you kind of covered that in your presentations, but we've had a few questions that I'll again try and bundle up in the concept of time. One is around kind of setting boundaries. Is it fine just to engage with the tier one suppliers, and then perhaps rather than then going further down, do you incentivize them to go out to their suppliers? And at what point, whose emissions do they then belong to? That kind of almost version of that double counting again. So in terms of actually engaging with suppliers, do you kind of go to your biggest ones first and hope to create a ripple effect, or should you be reaching out to all of them? But another question that kind of builds onto that is, for those companies that perhaps already are working on this and they may be looking currently at offsetting, do you then use that in your own data? Do you have to kind of reveal that they're offsetting? Because they're not. It's offsetting is a contentious issue. I don't want to get into it now because it's a whole other subject in itself. It clearly has a role to play, but there's also some companies that are perhaps overly relying on that. So yeah, a couple of questions: engagement around suppliers, and then perhaps the role that offsetting plays on the value chain as well. Annabelle, if we start with you on those.
Yeah, sure. I love the word that you use there, like the ripple effect. I think I had said something like cascading kind of action through the supply chain, and that's definitely how it works in practice. So the starting point is to identify those top suppliers, engage with them, encourage them to get on board with the net zero journey, and then move that action throughout their supply chain as well. And then to the second point. I've forgotten what it was. Sorry.
About potentially supply.
Offsetting. Yeah.
Quick wins or the offsets rather than.
Yeah. So very often we have our clients come to us and say, our supply is carbon neutral. How do we acknowledge that in our footprint? And as you say, it's a bit of a contentious subject. It's quite a grey area. So we really just recommend that actually from your suppliers, you should always be asking for two different sets of data: their absolute emissions, and how they're making reductions in an absolute emission terms, and then the offsetting as something separate that they're doing as well. And you need to be tracking both numbers, because what you don't want to do is end up in a situation where your supplier is carbon neutral, but actually their absolute emissions are increasing year on year. As we know, that the whole aim of this is to make absolute emission reductions if we're going to stay within that 1.5 degree limit.
Great. And Sophie, you might not have any examples of suppliers that are using the offset routes, but certainly in terms of mapping and engaging with the tier ones and incentivizing them, what kind of methods did you guys use?
So I think for us it was about almost categorizing our suppliers into opportunity in terms of the emissions reductions opportunities within those suppliers, but also by size of supplier as well, and that sort of relationship that we have with those suppliers. Like I say, quite a lot of our largest suppliers have a huge amount of data themselves, and that's a really easy task of going to them, asking them for the information, and if they've done LCA work on the goods and the services that they provide us. And like I say, I've actually been really pleasantly surprised by how much information we have got back from those suppliers. But then also we've got quite a lot of small scale, quite a lot of one-man bands, a huge amount of work for us that contribute quite a lot to our footprint. And therefore, how we engage with them has been a lot more collaborative, and sort of engaging with them and upskilling with them and sort of working in partnership with them, similarly to how we're doing with our farmers, because we do that as a partnership relationship rather than just a supplier relationship. In regards to like the offsetting, I think it's fair to say it's segregating. It's that transparency of data. I know personally from having to report to large customers and having to report our emissions data to them, as well as now having to ask it from our suppliers, and say we're asked in lots of different ways for lots of different information, and sometimes it can be a bit frustrating because you're having to basically chop and change your information depending on who you're getting it for, but definitely keeping separate any offsetting or biogenic emissions, especially like within the agricultural, the sequestration emissions. We need to keep those separate for now until that methodology is more concrete and confirmed.
Great, and I'm wary of time. I do have one more question. Again, it was another theme that cropped up a lot. So if I'm going to get a real bullet point answer from both of you on this, and it is just for the organisations that are perhaps feeling that they're unable to kind of get this into the boardroom for even just to raise awareness of it or get it for sign off. We're in an interesting place in terms of the economy where a lot of businesses are rightfully, still focusing on contingency plans to kind of keep themselves afloat. So how do you kind of get some boards to really start to then, look outside their own four walls and start to something which is, as we highlighted today, a massive but vital undertaking. So Sophie, if we get the first point from you.
Yeah, I think sort of linking it all the way back to our core values, we want to be a company that people want to work for and with, and sustainability is at the heart of that. And it's not something that companies can overlook now. We're facing a staffing crisis right now, and we want to try and recruit as many people as possible, and being a sustainable business is all part of that.
Great, thank you, Sophie. Some nice optimistic reasons around value there and purpose there. So thank you very much for that. And Annabelle will have last words from you as well.
Yeah, sure. I'd really just try and kind of position this in a language that's going to make sense to the board. So from thinking about it from a risk perspective, so I mentioned that kind of upcoming regulation and the need to understand Scope 3 to be able to comply with that. And also about in the language of kind of your customers and making sure that you are, their number one choice and are above your competitors in terms of sustainability performance.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you both for this. We are just running out of time. So a big thank you to Annabelle and, of course, Sophie and, of course, Carbon Intelligence for assisting us with this masterclass. The audience as well, massive thank you to you. There were so many questions, more than 70 came through in the course of an hour, which is quite a huge undertaking. We will try and perhaps get some questions, whether they were kind of aimed at either one or both of Sophie or Annabelle regarding certain things. And we'll try and get some answers to you via email if we can. But this has been a really engaging session. I hope you all agree. You will receive an email when a recording of this is available to watch back. So if there was a particular slide or a particular point someone made you wanted to really kind of double check, you will be able to do that when you get that email. And that will include also a few notes about upcoming events that we're hosting. Speaking of which, on Thursday, the 7th of October, we will be hosting a 1-hour webinar that's going to bring together a selection of certified B Corps to discuss how that process worked and what role the in-house sustainability and CSR teams have played and the benefits experienced so far. For those that don't know, ED's publisher, Faversham House, is joining the B Corp movement, and we'll have an ED representative on board to discuss that on that webinar. I've added a link in the chat for anyone interested in that. And then the following week, Thursday, the 14th of October, we're going to be running a masterclass on helping businesses stay ahead of the curve with the third phase of the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme and identifying fresh opportunities to align current energy audits with net zero targets. Again, for those who find that relevant, there is a link in the chat. So there's a lot coming up on the horizon for Edie, and of course for us with COP just around the corner. I'm sure the conversation around value chain decarbonisation on the road to net zero will continue to strengthen. But once again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you found this as insightful and educational as I did. And until next time, goodbye.